My very first day of law school, I walked into the building and there was a large room filled with activity tables. I was immediately drawn to this table. I was a member of the Temple chapter when I went to law school there and made a lot of very close, dear friends. My class had an enormously active group of people. We organized a food stamp project, which in later years was taken over by the law school. Perhaps another word might have been co-opted by the law school. We were active in organizing opposition to military recruiting in the law school. By my second year, I knew I wanted to do criminal defense and be a public defender. Let me just add something that I think is worth preserving. People often ask criminal defense lawyers, how can you represent people you know are guilty? My answer to that was always, well, it's twofold. And one is the cliche about everyone's entitled to a vigorous, zealous defense. But I would often tell people that that never bothered me as much as pleading guilty an innocent guy. One of my first cases, when I started, you went in one of three judges, and one of them was this crazy man, absolutely crazy. He was a delightful guy until the gavel sounded to start the case. Until the gavel sounded to end the case, he was absolutely a terror. I had this guy accused of some minor drug dealing offense who insisted he was not guilty. And I believed him. But we're sitting in this back room, and I'm telling him that if he is convicted, which is likely considering the evidence, this judge is going to whack him. And this is the offer they made him, and he's going to... The question I always used to say to clients is, I go home when you and I are done. The question is, when do you go home? And I remember talking to this guy, and the sheriffs were there saying, listen to your lawyer. This judge is nuts. He's crazy. And at some point, the DA reads the facts that they would attempt to prove, and the judge says, are those facts true? Or is that what happened? Or something of that sort. And if it's not a NOLO plea where you plead no contest, the guy has to say yes, which is probably perjury, probably not true. But that's the charade you have to go through in the oxymoronic criminal justice system.
Okay. We're rolling. All right, we're rolling. Hi, I'm Holly Maguigan, a member of the Lawyers Guild since 1969.
I'm Suzanne Young, and I'm a member of the Lawyers Guild since law school, which was between 77 and 80, because I don't exactly know when I joined the Guild.
And I'm Karen Detamore. I'm a member of the Lawyers Guild since 1973.
I remember going to the National Convention in 1969, which was one of the first ones where there were fights about whether legal workers should have full voting rights in the chapters. And I was from Philadelphia, where that question just wouldn't even come up. And I remember thinking, these are the lefties? Wait, this is a debate.
When I was in law school, I was looking for a progressive community somewhere to put my energies. And of course, in the Philadelphia area, I went to Rutgers Camden. And so, but I was living in Philadelphia for the first 2 years of law school, so I was very much aware of Philadelphia politics. And so what I learned right away was the most exciting, sexy, progressive law firm around was the law firm of Kairys, Rudovsky, and Maguigan. And so, Holly, how did that firm start?
Also known as Cram.
Also known as Cram. Yes, we liked Cram. It was a good name. When I first worked for them, before I was a partner, I was an associate, and the Rolling Stones were coming to Philadelphia, and I told them I needed 2 days off. And they said, 2 days? I said, well, yeah, of course. 1 day to get ready and 1 day to recover. It was not the way they thought about the world. We did all right. We got along fine. We just had different matters to focus on.
Jema.
So Jema was a legal worker then
Jema Abdu.
Right, who after she left Philadelphia went to the national office. This was years later. While she was in Philadelphia, did more amazing police misconduct litigation than anybody in the country. And people all over the country credit her with having gotten people going and starting organizing those cases and using those cases in support of various community movements. And she was very clear about the litigation being one piece of organizing and about its capacity for distracting. But the litigation she did was totally fabulous.
And one sort of interesting analogy, at that time I was a legal worker as well, and Jema and I did a lot of the Lawyers Guild work in Philadelphia. There was a lawyer that gets described as a character a lot, Harry Lore.
Harry Lore.
That I ran into one day on the street in the block of our office, and he said, Karen Detamore, yes, you and Jema Abdu. It's sort of exactly like Lenin in his sealed train hurtling across Europe on the eve of the revolution in Russia, except it's two broads with a typewriter up there. It's the only person that I wouldn't have hit for calling me a broad, but it was, after all, in an analogy to Lenin, so I decided
to let it go.
Yeah, let it go.
One of the things about the Guild in the whole time I was here was that people actually thought it was important to have a good time and to be nice to each other, to actually encourage each other and feed each other and just be sweet. And the fun part was really important.
Yes.
Well, when I got out of law school, I had the wonderful opportunity to create a feminist law collective, and my partners. It was actually focused on lesbian and gay rights, and I did that for about 4 years, and it was it was really a wonderful experience. But unfortunately, as often happens, people have difference of opinions as to how one should proceed or what should happen, and so we went our separate ways. And then I got involved in doing work with legal services and prepaid union legal services, and to this day now, for something approaching 20 years, I mean, I've done various things, but somewhere approaching 20 years I've been doing legal services here in Philadelphia.
And I did my own private practice, sharing space with other sharing space with other people, but focusing on military law and representing military service members and veterans. And then worked for the American Friends Service Committee for a while, and then went to Friends of Farm Workers, where I worked for 20 years.
I was in law school at NYU Law School from 1964 to 1967. The Guild was in a pretty dormant phase. In the mid-'60s, it started to rejuvenate by the time I graduated from law school. I actually wound up in Albany, Georgia in 1965. I worked for a spectacular lawyer, a guy named C.B. King, who was the only African-American lawyer in all of Southwest Georgia. Learned a lot. King later was involved in the Guild as well. So a lot of the people who were involved in that kind of activity were later Guild members. So opened our practice in '71, and that was kind of parallel to the Guild. There were a number of startups around the country, similar to ours, so we met other lawyers who were trying to do that, and mainly through the Guild. And by that time, the Guild really was starting to come back together again. We actually shared space with the Guild in our law office when we started, so a lot of it we did jointly. We got involved very quickly in some interesting cases. Prison reform litigation here in Philadelphia. Almost from the day we started, we were involved, David particularly, in the Camden 28 defense, draft protesters who were arrested. We were involved in a big lawsuit against the FBI for harassment of people in Philadelphia after the media FBI files were, I would call, liberated by a number of activists. We were involved in a large number of kind of supportive anti-war protesters in Philadelphia, either in terms of their First Amendment rights or if they were arrested. We started slowly, but soon it became the main staple of the office, police misconduct litigation. When we started, there was very little of that in the courts. So the practice, well, we just thought it was one of these gambles you take and say, well, we'll try it. See if it works, and 40 years later, somehow we're still here.
And the Guild was also, while it was doing all these cases and, you know, all this nuts and bolts law firm stuff and all the politics, it was also trying to do theoretical work, thinking about the role of law in progressive change. And what do we accomplish, you know, with our cases, and is it part of some more theoretical understanding? People would debate whether electoral office is even worth it, or more Marxist ways of thinking, where it's at. And then within Marxism, there would be 5 or 6 different trends at any given time, sometimes more. And they all had theories about law. All the progressive movements had theories about law. And then I was, at the same time, I got involved with a group of mainly law professors who were originating what became critical legal studies. And I was very keen on trying to ally them, the two groups. And so that's part of what the Theoretical Studies Committee was. We held events at all the Guild national functions, usually very well attended. And we'd have somebody come in who was either an academic or a historian or something like that, political scientist, and talk about, you know, the role of this thread of cases or this kind of legal action or something like that, or more generally the role of law in social change. The legal focus can dissipate or really be inconsistent with either a movement or the interest of clients. You learn that movements are not typical clients. You have to view them as movements. They aren't necessarily, they're not only focused on the win or the most money or whatever it is. There are certain things that they are going to want to do or not do that may contradict the easiest or what looks like the best legal strategy.
I loved graduate school, but law school was just deadly. My first class in law school, the teacher called on me. There was a hypo, and then she said, after class, don't you remember our case? And the hypo was a case in which I was a plaintiff, and the teacher was one of the lawyers. When I graduated, I had friends, that same little crew of people, and we, not knowing anything, we started the Juvenile Law Center. I mean, we really didn't know what we were doing. And at that time, Kairys, Rudovsky, and Maguigan were moving into a new office space that had space in it. And they encouraged me to come. They said, oh, there's space, and they'll help me get started with the labor thing that I had always intended to do. And so that's what I did. There was a case against a Pennsylvania tear gas manufacturer. The tear gas was used in Gaza and the West Bank, and there were a lot of fatalities. They needed someone to go and interview the witnesses. Oh, take depositions or do discovery. And someone said, oh, ask Judith, she'll go. So I went. And at the end of it, I said, gee, that was fun. I did Doe versus Unocal, which is a case against a U.S. oil company that was eventually bought by Chevron for using slave labor to build a pipeline in Burma. And as a matter of fact, it was settled. One of the things that happened as a result of the settlement is that there's a fund to help communities and individuals who were affected by the pipeline. And in a week, I'm going back to Thailand for a board meeting for that fund. And I have to say, it's one of the most successful things I've done as a lawyer. I mean, that had not just a fine legal result, but had demonstrable effect and continues to have a good effect on the community that it was intended for.
Well, I was very active in the anti-war movement, mainly because I was subject to possibly being drafted and sent to Vietnam, and that is a real wake-up call for a young man. And so when I went to law school, I decided that I would take that activism with me and try to use a law degree in a positive way, consistent with the principles that I had come to believe in those days of activism. And then I got to hear about Dave Rudovsky and a cluster of progressive lawyers on Walnut Street. I was invited to a couple functions and went, and was pleasantly surprised to find a healthy number of progressive lawyers, both housed in that area and others who were connected in other ways, the Guild being the main one. And they said, why don't you come and join our collective? So I did. And that was how I got involved into the collective. And it was an excellent move, much more progressive environment, much more healthy environment. We did well, co-counseling cases with Rudovsky and others. And the Guild offices actually were in our collective for about 15 years. And so, we didn't have to go far. And we had Guild events there and meetings there and so on and so forth. And then in 1990, the advent of IOLTA funding came along. There was additional resources for the legal aid programs, and they decided to formalize the institutional effort rather than have 5 separate programs doing it. They would make it into a standalone project and have a director. And I was the senior most person, so I became the director around 1990. And that's how we went about where we are today.
I did various types of litigation that changed according to what was going on at the time. There was a while that I was doing some police misconduct stuff. I was doing prison litigation. It has varied over the years. I opened my own practice in 1984. I had a little background in prison stuff. I worked for the ACLU National Prison Project when I was in law school. I went to Hofstra Law School. The thing that really made it tolerable for me was that there was a guild chapter, and I did a lot with the guild chapter. I started a women's law journal that was Progressive Journal. Started a prison project. There, going into the prisons, and there weren't very good law libraries in those days, and trying to do that. And Hyatt Legal Services was one of these things that was set up to represent the working poor. It wound up that it attracted a lot of people like me who were progressive to work there and were kind of trying to figure out what to do, because you couldn't get jobs either in public interest or it was very hard to get a job at the time with like CLS or something like that. So I realized very quickly that I can do this private practice stuff and that I can subsidize anything I want to do. There was a big demo at Independence Mall, and it was crazy. The police went crazy, and they had horses and tons of people arrested and stuff. And so we started running around getting information from everybody, and essentially not planning to be legal observers, but we were. And so then we worked with a coalition of people and brought a lawsuit that resulted in opening up the rules, the First Amendment rights that were connected to the Independence Mall. And so at that point, I sort of took over the guild. Because the problem was that we were all kind of middle-aged. The most active people were middle-aged, and everybody had kids, and it was really hard to get anybody to do anything. Part of what I realized that we could do, or a role that I could play, was also to make sure that the guild had representation in doing the political lawsuits of the time. And so because I was with Kairys and Rudovsky, I also hooked on to a lot of that, and I was also friends with Stefan Presser, who was the ACLU person who was also doing a lot of the litigation. And I kept trying to get them to identify themselves as from the guild, but instead it was the ACLU or Kairys and Rudovsky or whatever. But it didn't get out there as much as it needed to be. So I was trying to do that. And so I'm thrilled and amazed at what's happened to the local guild, because it's like this whole generation has just appeared in the last couple of years, and they're doing so much.
The Philadelphia chapter historically was pretty big and extremely active. So we were really surprised to find that it had atrophied so much.
What did you and Ryan do to kind of revitalize the chapter?
First, we talked to everybody to find out what was going on. Then we made a plan and decided, well, we don't have a budget, so we can't get people back involved if we're not doing anything, and we can't do anything without any money. So we'll start with the law students. And having been a former union organizer, it was fairly obvious how to do it. So the first thing we did was we ran around to all the local law schools, and so we focused on that for a while, and then figured we could start projects or help them start projects at the law school level, and then we could use that information. And once the law school chapters really started to go, Ryan would work, because he's much younger, would work much more with the law students, and I would start working with the older members. and I would take what the law students were doing to them and explain, you know, here's all the stuff that's happening, there's new life, it's time to pay your dues and get active again. They start getting excited, and first maybe they pay their dues, then maybe they start coming to an event or two, then maybe they give us more than the minimum amount of cash, and then pretty soon they start like working on projects. And that's how we started getting projects beyond just the law schools going. So it was a pretty rational plan, and I think it's working fairly nicely.
Well, I think most of the kinds of changes we really want to see politically and socially are not going to come about just by litigation. As much as I worked on litigation the last 20 years, and that's an important piece of it, it's got to be tied to community organizing and to helping other people know what their rights are and where they can get help, and doing media work and getting people together in coalitions and doing that kind of work. And I think that it's really hard and it really takes time, but if you try to rely just on projects where we do litigation, it's just not going to be enough. Plus, most people are going to find other ways to do litigation through this legal services program or whatever. It's the Guild really needs to fill that gap of doing all these other things, the demonstration observers and this, and media, and community coalitions, and all those things.